On June 7, 2026, Donald Trump told the Financial Times exactly who was in charge of the Iran negotiations. "I call the shots. I call all the shots," he said, making clear that Netanyahu had no real say in the matter. He'd said something similar to Axios that same day, promising he was about to call Netanyahu personally and tell him to stand down after Iran fired a fresh round of missiles at Israel, the first real exchange since a fragile ceasefire had quieted things down back in April. A few hours after that interview ran, Israeli jets were over Iran, hitting military and energy targets in the center and west of the country. The White House did not deny it happened. It did not confirm it either. It just went quiet. And that silence is doing more work in this story than almost anything else that happened that week. By the next morning, the story had already been written for you. Senator Chris Murphy posted that the war had become humiliating for Trump and American power generally, and that when Trump announces he's calling Netanyahu to stop a strike, and Netanyahu strikes anyway within hours, the humiliation only compounds. Outlets across the world ran some version of the same idea. The American president had been defied, in public, by the leader of a country that depends on America for nearly everything it needs to fight a war. It's a good story. It has a hero, a villain, and a twist. The small, dependent ally outmaneuvers the superpower that arms and protects it. But good stories and true stories aren't always the same thing, and there's a question buried under this one that almost nobody asked out loud in the rush to cover the defiance angle. If the United States genuinely wanted to stop that strike, why didn't it? Stop and think about what the United States actually gives Israel, year in and year out. Washington provides Israel with close to $3.8 billion annually under a 10-year military assistance agreement, plus hundreds of millions more earmarked specifically for joint missile defense programs. Investigations have found that close to half of all weapons entering Israel originate in the United States. The Aegis destroyers parked in the eastern Mediterranean feed missile tracking data into Israel's air defense grid in real time. American satellite and signals intelligence tells Israeli planners where to aim. None of that depends on Israeli factories or Israeli satellites. It depends on Washington, continuously, every single day this war has gone on. If a president genuinely wants to stop an ally from striking, he has tools that don't require asking nicely on the phone. Slow a shipment. Pause an intelligence feed for 48 hours. Quietly let an ally know that the next request will sit on a desk a little longer than usual. None of that happened. Not before the strike on Iran, and, more tellingly, not after it either. In the hours immediately following the attack, Trump was supposedly furious and humiliated about. The systems kept running. The intelligence kept flowing. Nothing was paused, slowed, or quietly withheld. This isn't a hypothetical tool that doesn't actually exist in practice. The previous administration paused a shipment of heavy bombs to Israel back in 2024, specifically to register disapproval over how a different military campaign was being run. Whatever you think of that particular call, it proves the mechanism is real and gets used when an administration genuinely wants to send that kind of message. This administration didn't reach for it once, at any point. Before or after the strike, everyone agreed was humiliating. You don't keep protecting someone who just embarrassed you in front of the entire world unless the embarrassment wasn't actually the point. There's a real argument for the version where Netanyahu simply acted alone, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away. CNN and other outlets reported that Trump had personally called Netanyahu and persuaded him to hold off on a planned strike on Tehran, and that, according to people close to the talks, Trump genuinely believed it had worked. Days earlier, Trump had reportedly exploded at Netanyahu on a separate call over Israel's escalation against Hezbollah in Lebanon, telling him bluntly that he was fucking crazy and that everybody now hates Israel because of it. That's not the behavior of a puppet master pulling strings from a comfortable distance. It's the behavior of a man who keeps discovering his calls aren't landing the way he expects. Netanyahu also has a domestic incentive to ignore Washington that has nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program. He's heading into a competitive election, and rivals across the political spectrum have built part of their case around the idea that a strong Israeli leader tells an American president no when it's necessary, not just yes when it's convenient. Far-right ministers in his own coalition publicly pushed him in exactly that direction during this same stretch of fighting, urging him not to let Washington dictate Israel's military response. For a politician in that position, being seen to defy an American president isn't a cost. It's a credential, and arguably a necessary one. Put those pieces together, and you get a coherent, evidence-backed theory. The tail wagging the dog. Israel, the smaller and more dependent partner, pulling a reluctant Washington into a conflict it didn't fully choose, on a timeline it didn't set. Serious people hold this view, and the paper trail, the calls, the public frustration, the visible friction between two men who were once nearly inseparable allies, genuinely supports it. It's just incomplete. It explains why Netanyahu might want to strike regardless of what Washington preferred. It doesn't explain why Washington, holding every lever capable of actually stopping him, chose not to pull a single one, either before the strike or in its aftermath. So consider a less comfortable possibility, that Washington didn't restrain Israel because restraint was never actually in Washington's interest either, whatever the public messaging suggested to voters back home. You don't have to read between the lines to find this argument. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most senior Republican voices on foreign policy and a longtime advocate for confronting Iran, has said it plainly and on camera more than once. Discussing the war alongside the parallel American operation against Venezuela's government, Graham pointed out that Iran and Venezuela together hold roughly 31% of the world's known oil reserves, and argued that an American partnership covering that share of global supply would be, in his words, China's nightmare. He's also argued, separately, that toppling Iran's government entirely would be enormously profitable for the United States and would let Washington install a more cooperative government in Tehran. These aren't leaked memos or anonymous sourcing. They're a sitting senator, on camera, describing the financial upside out loud, more than once, without apparent concern about how it sounded. Once you hear that framing, a few other things about this war start to look different. Iran's retaliatory capability getting tested in live combat, with American radar and missile defense systems quietly collecting real performance data the entire time, isn't only a military event. It's also a free stress test of an adversary's weapons, the kind of thing militaries normally have to wargame for years, rather than simply observe in real time. A weakened Iran that can no longer credibly threaten the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a regional win for Israel, it's leverage over global energy markets that China, in particular, depends on heavily. None of this requires a secret pact scribbled out between Washington and Jerusalem. It only requires their interests to overlap closely enough that actually restraining each other was never really the priority either side was pursuing in private, however loudly they said otherwise in public. The price of oil tells part of this story on its own. It climbed past $100 a barrel as the fighting escalated, with Gulf producers cutting output, tankers stranded, and airspace closed across the region. Japan began preparing to release reserves. Vietnam dropped its fuel import tariffs. China asked its refiners to halt fuel exports. None of those governments benefit from this war. Some of the parties closest to it, on the other hand, have been remarkably candid about expecting to. The Venezuela piece makes the pattern harder to dismiss as coincidence. Around this same stretch of time, American commandos captured Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro, and Washington moved to recognize an acting president seen as more willing to cooperate with the United States. Graham was the one drawing a direct line between the two operations himself, treating Iran and Venezuela as a single oil portfolio rather than two unrelated foreign policy problems on opposite sides of the planet. It's also worth remembering this isn't the first time a war justified on security grounds has ended with American officials talking openly about regional reshaping and the money that follows it. Graham himself was a vocal supporter of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a war that destabilized the region for a generation and is estimated to have cost hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. None of that proves history is repeating itself exactly. It does mean "this is purely about stopping a bomb" framing has real competition from people who lived through the last version of that same sentence. That reframes the entire humiliation headline. If the outcome Washington actually wanted, a degraded Iran with less regional and economic leverage, was happening regardless of who got credit for the strike, there was no real reason to spend political capital stopping it. Stepping aside isn't the same as losing control. Sometimes it just means you didn't want control over that particular outcome to begin with. Here's where the two readings actually meet, rather than compete. Trump and Netanyahu didn't need to be secretly coordinating behind closed doors for both of these things to be true at once. Each had a domestic audience to perform for, and the performances pointed in opposite directions almost by design. Trump needed to look like the cautious statesman to voters exhausted by 2 decades of Middle East entanglements, to markets that flinch at every headline capable of moving oil prices, and to allies who want reassurance that Washington still attempts diplomacy before authorizing bombs. That meant being seen trying to stop the strike, the phone calls, the on-record claim that he calls the shots, the visible effort to look like the restrained adult in the room. Netanyahu needed the opposite image for his own electorate, a leader who answers to Israeli security needs and nobody else's preferences, especially with rivals across the spectrum waiting to brand him a foreign puppet the moment he looks compliant. That meant being seen defying Washington publicly and without apology, even at the cost of an awkward phone call. Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft has offered a version of this that's worth sitting with. That Trump's willingness to restrain Israel seems conditional on already having a deal worth protecting, rather than on helping secure one in the first place. In other words, restraint isn't the default setting. It's a tool Washington reaches for selectively, when it serves an outcome Washington already wants, which is a very different thing from genuinely trying and failing to control an ally. 2 leaders, 2 domestic audiences, 2 performances that look like open conflict from the outside, while the underlying outcome, a weakened Iran and a reshuffled regional balance of power, served what each side's government actually wanted, regardless of who got blamed for it in the headlines the next morning. Now for the honest caveat, because this theory is genuinely contested, and plenty of people who study this region closely don't buy the strongest version of it. Some analysts argue the friction is real, not theatre, and that turning every disagreement into evidence of secret coordination gives both governments too much credit for foresight they probably don't have. Israeli journalist Gideon Levy has made nearly the opposite case, that Israel's dependence on American weapons and financing has actually left Netanyahu with almost no real room to defy Washington at all, and that the appearance of defiance is mostly just that, appearance, not real leverage, because Israel genuinely cannot take on a war of this scale without the United States behind it. Other regional specialists describe the relationship as transactional rather than coordinated. Trump tolerates Netanyahu's independent streak when the cost of cracking down outweighs the benefit to him personally, not because any specific outcome was scripted in advance between 2 governments working from the same playbook. Both readings can explain the same set of facts, which is worth sitting with, rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. Maybe Washington didn't pull its levers because doing so would have meant a costly, public rupture with an ally it can't easily replace, not because it secretly wanted the strike to happen at all. Genuine asymmetric dependency and a quiet overlap of interests aren't mutually exclusive. Figuring out which one is doing more of the work in any single decision is hard, even for people with far more access to the relevant rooms than any of us will ever have. What isn't really in dispute is the senator's comments about oil reserves and profit, the documented timeline of the calls and strikes, and the fact that nothing about America's military or intelligence support to Israel changed before or after the moment Trump was supposedly humiliated on the world stage. Those are checkable facts, sitting in plain sight in wire reports and on senators' own social media accounts. What you do with them? Read this as Israel running loose on a leash Washington genuinely tried and failed to hold, or as 2 governments each getting something they separately wanted out of appearing to disagree, is the part that's genuinely still open, and probably will stay that way until people with real access start talking on the record. So before accepting the cleanest version of a story like this one, the version with a clear hero, a clear villain, and a satisfying twist, It's worth asking a simple question. Who benefits if you stop paying attention the moment the headline feels resolved? That question won't hand you a final answer tonight, but it's a far better habit to build than reaching for the first explanation that also happens to be the easiest one to repeat to a friend. None of this requires you to believe in a grand, tidy conspiracy with a signed agreement somewhere in a drawer. Most of the world's messiest outcomes don't need one. They just need two governments with overlapping incentives, a media cycle that rewards the simplest available narrative, and enough silence in the right places to let that narrative run unchallenged for a few news cycles before anyone checks the math. The humiliation story was never wrong about what happened on the surface. Netanyahu did strike. Trump's call did fail to stop him. What it leaves out is everything underneath that surface, the leverage that sat unused, the profit that was discussed openly rather than hidden, and the fact that both leaders walked away from that week with exactly the domestic image each of them needed. If breakdowns like this are useful to you, that's exactly what the like and subscribe buttons are for. And if there's someone in your life who only ever gets the headline version of stories like this one, this might be worth sending their way.